The morning my wife had her stroke, I called my son and asked him for $2,000. He told me he'd just closed a $12 million deal, and that there was no money for me. That same afternoon, my daughter, who had almost nothing left in the world, sent me $2,000 without a single question. I want to tell you how I got to that phone call, because it didn't start there. It started 30 years earlier with a man who thought he was doing everything right. My name is David Whitman. I am 62 years old. I live outside Sacramento, California. I have one son and one daughter. And for most of my life, I loved my son so much that I never stopped to ask myself a simple question: whether love given without limits can sometimes blind you to who a person has actually become. I built a small precision tools manufacturing company from the ground up, starting in a rented garage the year I turned 29. My wife, Eleanor, worked the books in the evenings after her own job, while I ran machines during the day and chased contracts on weekends. We had 2 children, Michael our son, Rachel our daughter. I won't pretend I loved them equally in every practical way, though I told myself for years that I did. Michael was the one who followed me into the business. He learned the machines. He learned the contracts. By the time he was 30, he was running half the company alongside me, and I was prouder of him than I have ever been able to fully put into words. Rachel went a different direction. She became a school teacher, modest income, modest life. She married a man named Tom, kind, a little restless, always chasing one more opportunity that would finally make things easier for them. I loved her too. I want to be clear about that before this story goes anywhere. I loved her too. But somewhere in those years, without ever deciding it consciously, I started treating my son's life as the one that mattered more. When Michael married Ashley, I was happy, genuinely happy. She was polished, confident, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood who held influence and who didn't. I told myself that confidence was exactly what my son needed as he took on more responsibility in the company. I didn't notice, not for a long time, the way she'd redirect conversations at family dinners. The way she'd gently correct Michael in front of us, the way you'd correct a child. The way she'd ask almost casually whether the company's ownership structure was modernized yet, whether everything was properly protected. I thought she was smart. I didn't understand yet that smart and safe are not always the same thing. I remember one dinner, maybe a year into their marriage, where Ashley asked me almost gently why I still personally signed off on every major vendor contract instead of letting the systems do their job. I told her it was just how I'd always run things, one signature, one person accountable. She smiled and said that was sweet, very old-fashioned, and changed the subject to something about the kitchen renovation they were planning. I laughed it off that night. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 years, until it started to matter in ways I couldn't have predicted at that dinner table. As I got older, as my knees started aching in the mornings, as I started forgetting small things I never used to forget, I began thinking seriously about the future, about what would happen to everything I'd built once I wasn't around to run it anymore. An estate attorney, a man I'd known for 15 years, sat across from me one afternoon and laid it out simply. Transfer the business into Michael's name now while I was alive and able to guide the transition properly. Avoid the mess of probate later. Let my son step fully into the role he'd already been performing for years. It made sense. Every piece of it made sense. I remember Eleanor sitting beside me in the attorney's office that day, quiet through most of the meeting, and afterward in the car she asked me once carefully, "Are you sure about all of it going to Michael's name, not held some other way between both of them?" I told her Michael was the one running the company, it made practical sense, and Rachel had her own life, her own path, she wouldn't want the burden of it anyway. Eleanor didn't argue. She just looked out the window for a long moment and said, "All right, David, you know best." I think about that car ride more than almost any other memory from those years, because some quiet part of her, even then, seemed to already understand something I wasn't ready to see yet. So I did it. Over the course of about 18 months, I transferred the company, the real estate it sat on, several investment accounts I'd built over 3 decades. In total, when everything was finally signed and recorded, it came to just over $30 million in assets, all now legally belonging to my son. I remember the day I signed the final document. Eleanor squeezed my hand under the table. Michael hugged me, actually hugged me, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, and said, "Dad, I promise you this changes nothing between us." I believed him. I want you to remember that promise, because we are going to come back to it. For the first year after the transfer, things did seem mostly the same. Sunday dinners continued, a little less frequent than before, but still happening. Then Ashley became pregnant with their first child, and the dinners moved to their house instead of ours, which felt natural enough at the time. Then slowly, so slowly I didn't notice the pattern until I was already deep inside it, things began to shift. Ashley started mentioning in that light, offhand way she had that the house felt crowded when we visited, that the grandchildren's routines were very structured now and unexpected visits were hard on them. Michael, who used to call me every few days just to talk about nothing in particular, started calling once a week, then every other week. I told Eleanor it was just a busy new phase of life. New baby, growing business. I told myself the same thing every time I felt that small ache of being politely, gradually pushed to the edge of my own son's life. The house Eleanor and I lived in, the house we'd raised both our children in, had been part of that 18-month transfer too, refinanced under the company's holding structure as part of the estate plan, with the understanding, spoken but never actually written anywhere, that Eleanor and I would live there for as long as we wanted. Understanding. Not a document. Just words spoken across a kitchen table that I trusted completely. 2 years after the transfer, Michael came to see us. Alone, without Ashley, which should have told me something before he even opened his mouth. He sat down across from me at that same kitchen table and told me carefully that Ashley felt it made more financial sense for them to sell the house and move into something that better fit the company's growth plans. That there was a modest condo, already selected, about 20 minutes away, that would be perfect for Eleanor and me. I asked him directly. I said, "Michael, is this what you want? Or is this what Ashley wants?" He didn't answer that question, not directly. He just said, "Dad, it's what's best for the family, for all of us." Eleanor and I moved into that condo 3 weeks later. It was smaller than our old kitchen alone had once been. I want to be honest with you about something. I didn't fight it, not really, not the way I probably should have. Some part of me still believed that if I stayed patient, stayed generous, stayed the father who never asked for anything back, eventually my son would remember who he used to be. I was wrong about a lot of things during those years, but I was most wrong about that. 18 months into life in that condo, Eleanor started having headaches. Bad ones. The kind that made her wince in bright light, made her hold the edge of the counter when she stood up too fast. I told her we needed to see a specialist. She kept saying we'd wait, that it was probably just stress, that the new insurance situation. Since our coverage had also shifted when the business restructured, another detail I hadn't fully understood until it mattered made specialist visits complicated and expensive. 3 months after the headaches started, on a Tuesday morning while I was in the next room making coffee, Eleanor collapsed in the hallway. I called an ambulance. I rode with her to the hospital, holding her hand the entire way, watching the right side of her face pull slightly downward in a way that terrified me more than almost anything I'd ever seen. The stroke was moderate, not catastrophic. But moderate strokes still require immediate imaging, immediate specialist care, medication that our reduced insurance plan only partially covered. The hospital financial office told me, that same afternoon, standing in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear, that I needed to put down $2,000 before they could schedule the follow-up imaging Eleanor needed within the recommended window. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I had on paper given my son $30 million. And in that hospital hallway, I did not have 2,000. I called Michael. My hands were actually shaking as I dialed, which embarrassed me even in that moment, because I had never in my life had to call my son and ask him for money. He picked up on the third ring, sounding distracted, like he was in the middle of something important. "Dad, hey, can this wait? We're actually in the middle of closing something huge." "Michael, your mother had a stroke. She's at the hospital. I need $2,000 for her imaging. They won't schedule it without a deposit and our coverage." He cut me off, not unkins. DLY exactly, but distracted in a way that felt worse than unkind somehow. "Dad, I'm so sorry, that's terrible, but honestly right now isn't a great time. We just closed $12 million on the Fresno acquisition, everything's tied up in escrow accounts, cash flow is genuinely tight this week. There's no money for you, Dad, I'm sorry. Can you check with the hospital about a payment plan?" I stood in that hallway holding my phone, listening to my son explain cash flow to me, in a company built on money I had personally handed him. I said, "All right, Michael," because I didn't know what else to say, and I hung up. I sat down on a plastic chair in that hallway, and I did something I hadn't done in front of anyone since I was a young man burying my own father. I put my head in my hands. My phone rang about 40 minutes later. It was Rachel. I almost didn't answer because I didn't want her to hear my voice like that, but I did. "Dad, Mom's not answering her phone. Is everything okay?" I told her all of it. The stroke, the hospital, the $2,000, the call to Michael. There was a silence on the line, a long one. I need to tell you something about Rachel's life at that exact moment, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. 8 months earlier, her husband Tom had gotten involved in aggressive stock trading, convinced he'd finally found the opportunity that would change their lives. He'd taken out a home equity line without fully telling her the extent of it, chasing increasingly risky positions. When the market turned against him hard, over about 6 terrible weeks, he lost almost everything they had. The stress of it, the shame of it, contributed to a heart attack that took him from her 3 months later, at 41 years old. Rachel was, at that moment, a widowed schoolteacher, raising 2 kids alone, still fighting with a mortgage company about a home equity line she hadn't even known existed until after the funeral. She had almost nothing. I want to tell you something about Rachel that I haven't mentioned yet, because it matters for understanding who she actually was underneath all of this. Even before Tom's trading losses, before any of it, Rachel had never once asked us for money. Not during her wedding, which she and Tom paid for entirely themselves on a schoolteacher's salary and a modest contractor's income. Not when Emily was born early and the medical bills stacked up for months. Not even the year Tom lost his job for 11 weeks and they quietly ate through most of their savings without either of us knowing until long after it had passed. She had a kind of quiet pride about it, the same stubborn pride I recognized in myself at her age, and I had mistaken that pride for years as a sign she simply didn't need us the way Michael did. And on the phone in that hallway she said, "Dad, I have $2,000 in savings. It was for Emily's braces. I'm sending it to you right now." "Rachel, no, you can't." "Dad," her voice broke slightly, "you are not choosing between Mom's health and my daughter's teeth. Send me the hospital's payment information. I'm doing this." She sent it within the hour. I sat in that hallway holding my phone, looking at a notification from my daughter who had lost her husband and nearly everything else 8 months earlier. And I thought about my son, who had $12 million closing that same week, telling me there was no money for me. I want to tell you that this was the moment everything changed dramatically immediately. It wasn't. Life rarely works that cleanly. What actually happened is something I hadn't told anyone, not Eleanor, not either of my children, for almost 11 years. My own father, a quiet, careful man who never trusted any single institution completely, left me an inheritance when he passed away that I never fully folded into the business. About $1.2 million, invested conservatively, sitting in an account under my name alone, never mentioned in any of the estate planning conversations with my attorney, never mentioned to Michael during the transfer, never mentioned to anyone. I hadn't hidden it out of some calculated plan. I'd simply never gotten around to deciding what to do with it, and some quiet instinct, when I couldn't fully explain even to myself, had always told me to leave it alone. To keep one thing that was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. Sitting in that hospital hallway, I finally understood what that instinct had actually been protecting me from. I called my attorney that same evening and arranged to move $15,000 from that account quickly, to cover Eleanor's full treatment without waiting on insurance disputes or payment plans. I paid Rachel back her $2,000 the next morning, and when she tried to refuse it, I told her, as firmly as I have ever said anything to my daughter, "You showed up for your mother when you nothing left to give. Let me show up for you now that I can." Eleanor recovered well over the following months, though her right hand still shakes sometimes when she's tired, a small, permanent reminder of that morning in the hallway. I moved us out of that condo. Nothing dramatic, no confrontation, no dramatic announcement to Michael. I simply used part of that inheritance to lease a comfortable small house near Rachel and the grandchildren, close enough that I could pick Emily up from school sometimes. Close enough that Eleanor could sit on the porch some evenings and watch her grandchildren, Rachel's kids, run across the lawn. I saw Michael occasionally over the following year. Holidays mostly. Ashley was always polished, always warm in that practiced way, always mentioning some new expansion the company was planning. Michael seemed increasingly tired in a way I recognized, because I'd worn that exact tiredness myself decades earlier, in the early years of building something too fast without enough foundation underneath it. I didn't ask questions. I had learned slowly and painfully that my son's life was no longer mine to manage or worry over uninvited. There was one evening that year, though, that stayed with me longer than the others. A 4th of July gathering at Rachel's small backyard, string lights strung between the fence posts, the grandchildren running through a sprinkler while the adults sat in folding chairs drinking lemonade. Michael and Ashley came for a couple of hours, and at one point, watching Michael crouch down to help Emily light a sparkler, laughing in a way I hadn't heard from him in months, I let myself believe just for that one evening that everything underneath the surface was still fine. Ashley checked her phone 4 times in the span of that visit. I noticed it and told myself it was nothing. I have since learned to trust those small noticings more than I did that summer. About 14 months after that hallway phone call, I got a call from an old colleague, someone who still had connections in the industry I'd spent my whole life in. He told me carefully that there were rumors circulating about the company. Aggressive expansion into markets it didn't understand. Debt taken on faster than revenue could support it. A key acquisition, the Fresno deal, the same $12 million closing Michael had mentioned to me from that hospital hallway, apparently hadn't performed anywhere close to projections. I didn't reach out. I want to be honest about that too. Some old, stubborn part of me thought, let him figure it out the way I had to figure everything out 30 years earlier in a rented garage with no safety net at all. 6 months after that phone call from my old colleague, Michael showed up at my door. Alone. It was raining, a cold February evening, and he stood on my porch without an umbrella, looking smaller somehow than I remembered him looking in years. "Dad," he said, "can I come in?" We sat in my living room, the modest one, the one that belonged entirely to me, and he told me everything. The company was 6 weeks from bankruptcy. Ashley had left 2 months earlier, taking their children to stay with her parents in Phoenix after a series of arguments about money that had apparently been building for over a year. The house, the one they'd bought after selling mine, was in foreclosure proceedings. He hadn't slept properly in what looked, from the color under his eyes, like weeks. "I don't know what I'm asking you for," he said. "I don't think I have the right to ask you for anything. I didn't have anywhere else to go tonight." I want to tell you that I felt vindicated in that moment. Some ugly, small part of me expected to feel that. I didn't. I mostly just felt tired and sad, and underneath both of those things still, impossibly, love. The same love I'd felt holding him as a newborn 34 years earlier, before any of this had happened to either of us. I didn't answer him that night. I told him to sleep in the guest room, and in the morning we'd talk. I spent that night lying awake next to Eleanor, thinking about 2 different phone calls. The one where my son told me there was no money for me while $12 million sat in escrow. And the one where my daughter, with nothing left in the world, sent me every dollar she had without a single question. So I thought about what it would mean to help him now. Not blindly, the way I had 30 years earlier, handing over everything at once and calling it love, but clearly, with my eyes fully open this time. In the morning, I sat across from Michael at my kitchen table, the same way my father used to sit across from me, and I told him what I'd decided. I would give him $1 million, enough to satisfy the most immediate creditors, enough to avoid full bankruptcy, enough to give him a real chance to rebuild something smaller, more honest, more sustainable than what he'd tried to build with. Ashley. But I told him plainly, this was not $30 million handed over quietly with no real conversation behind it. This came with terms. He would rebuild without me running anything for him. He would actually show up for his mother, for his sister, for the family he'd drifted away from, not because I was paying him to, but because it was time he remembered how. He cried at that kitchen table. I hadn't seen my son cry since he was maybe 8 years old. "Why would you do this?" he asked, "after everything?" I told him the truth. "Because your sister taught me something in a hospital hallway that I should have already known. Love isn't measured by how much you're given. It's measured by what you do when you have almost nothing and someone you love needs you anyway." It has been a little over a year now since that rainy February night. Michael rebuilt slowly. A much smaller operation, careful, deliberately conservative in a way the old company never was. He calls every week now, actually calls, not the distracted, distant calls from those earlier years. He drives out most Sundays to see Eleanor and me, and lately he's started showing up at Rachel's house too, helping Emily with her math homework, something that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. Ashley and Michael finalized their divorce in the fall. He sees his children every other weekend, and from what I can tell, he's more present with them in those weekends now than he was during most of their daily life before. I still have most of that inheritance from my father, untouched, quiet, exactly the kind of thing I never expected to need and somehow always needed anyway. I think about it sometimes as more than just money. I think about it as the one thing in my life I never handed over on a promise alone, and how strange it is that the one thing I kept quietly for myself ended up saving every person I love the most. Eleanor's hand still shakes sometimes in the evenings. I hold it anyway, the same way I did in that ambulance, the same way I did across that kitchen table with my son. I think about that phone call often. My son, with $12 million closing that week, telling me there was no money for me. My daughter, with almost nothing left in the world, sending me everything she had without a single question. I used to believe that loving someone meant giving them everything, all at once, and trusting that love alone would be enough to hold it together. As I know better now, love isn't what you hand someone when everything is easy. It's what you still choose to give when you have almost nothing left. and someone you love needs you anyway. That's the only inheritance that ever really mattered. Not the 30 million I signed away in 18 months of careful paperwork. Not even the million I gave back quietly at my own kitchen table. It was $2,000, sent without hesitation by a daughter who had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. Sometimes in the evenings now, I sit on that small porch with Eleanor, watching the grandchildren, all of them Michael's kids and Rachel's kids together, running across the same patch of grass, and I think about how close I came to never learning any of this. I think about how easy it would have been to stay in that condo, quietly resentful, quietly proud, never questioning the promise my son made me at that kitchen table 30 years. And then again 18 months into a life I thought I understood. I don't regret building what I built. I don't even fully regret handing it over the way I did, because I don't think I would have arrived at the man sitting on this porch tonight without walking through every mistake that led me here. But if there is one thing I would tell my younger self sitting in that attorney's office 30 years ago, signing paper after paper with a proud, trusting hand, it would be this: generosity without honesty isn't love. It's just hope dressed up to look like certainty. And hope alone was never going to protect the people I cared about most. Rachel still teaches. Emily got her braces eventually paid for properly without anyone having to choose between a stroke and a smile. Michael still calls every week, and some Sundays when the whole family is gathered in that small backyard together, I catch him watching his sister across the yard with an expression I don't think he's fully found words for yet. I don't push him to explain it. Some things take longer to say out loud than others. I kept one thing quiet for 11 years, not out of distrust, but out of some instinct I never fully understood until the night it mattered most. I think now that instinct was trying to tell me something about all of us, long before I was ready to hear it. That the people who love you the most rarely announce it in the good years. They show you quietly in the years when there's nothing left to gain by showing up at all.